Hey folks, so in this video I want to talk about the Gnostic sect of the Cathars. I've spoken in another video about the relationship with anti-natalism and Gnosticism, but I want to be more specific in this one and address some of the Gnostic groups that have existed and have promoted and preached anti-natalism as a core of their spiritual belief. Now, the Gnostic Cathars existed in France, and they lived in the medieval ages, at the time when the Catholic Church was at the peak of its power, when the Church, had the ability to not only command nations but command armies and generally pretty much ruled the Western Hemisphere for a very long time. But the Cathars were a dualistic sect of Gnostics, and essentially they believed that the world had not come into being by accident. It did not spontaneously appear. They believed that it was caused by an evil, malevolent entity who they called the Demiurge or Yaldabaoth. And this Yaldabaoth is the god, quote unquote, of the material universe. It is this being that is worshipped by the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims as the one true God. And the Cathars essentially unmasked this entity and pretty much went down this radical belief that not only was the world created by a deficient God, but that this God itself is the true evil. It is the source of suffering, pain, misery, and sorrow, and that it intentionally created a world this way. That is why evil and suffering are unavoidable. That is why these things don't just accidentally happen. Suffering, evil, malintent, these things were produced onto this world with malice and with purposeful evil intent by this false God, this deficient entity that is being worshipped every single Sunday or every day by its servants, whether they are religious or not. But the Cathars saw this entity and they formulated in their doctrine that human beings were born of spirits, or rather, that the spirits within human beings had been kidnapped, so to speak, and made to be placed in human bodies. And this cycle of torment and torture in this physical mundane reality was perpetuated through the sex act, through the urge of reproduction and procreation. And for them, for the Cathars and other similar Gnostic groups, the best way to deal with this, the best way to approach this horrific situation that we find ourselves in, is to not only deny the God who done it, but to deny the program of this God by refusing to reproduce, by refusing to procreate more children into the material hell. Because the Cathars believed that this world was not only bad, but that it was a kind of hellish realm where the spirits would have to endure pain, suffering, and torture against their will. And unfortunately, the majority of the human species is under the control of this Demiurge, this Yaldabaoth, in the sense that they are influenced by it to keep this cycle of reproduction and birth and suffering and death going as much as they possibly can. So, in their official doctrine, the Cathars practiced abstinence. They also practiced same-sex relations. As a matter of fact, homosexuality and lesbianism were promoted oftentimes within the Cathar sect because these practices did not lead to procreation. It did not lead to the enslavement of another spirit that was brought down to suffer in a mortal body, which to them was the ultimate sin, the ultimate evil, the ultimate crime that could be committed was to kidnap another spirit and bind it into a material body where it would experience pain, suffering, and all these horrendous ordeals. And so these people were very revolutionary for the time that they lived in. And of course, these doctrines got the attention of the church because not only did the Cathars denounce the Christian God as the true devil, or rather the true evil, they also said that this world that it created was not good, and that this was a place, undeserving of sentient life. They believed that it was a place that, thrived on suffering and death and should be abandoned rather than praised. And so their doctrine went contrary to everything that the Catholic Church stands for. And around this time, the Catholic Church mounted against the Cathars a very vicious crusade. It was often called the Albigensian Crusade. And what happened was entire towns where the Cathars had lived had been destroyed. The Crusaders would go in and they would burn the whole towns to the ground. They would take the men and women and have them burned at the stake. They took the Cathar writings and burned them in an attempt to try to erase these people from existence, which ultimately they did fail, thankfully. But it just goes to show you the kind of spirit that these Crusaders had, and their viciousness against these Cathar saints, who pretty much were there preaching against the perpetuation of suffering, death, and sorrow in the mortal world. And even today, if you look at the religions, particularly the Abrahamic religions, these are the people who praise this cycle of reproduction and bringing forth new flesh into the mortal coil to suffer. They praise it, they glorify it. And so nothing has really changed between now and then. But the Cathars were just one sect. And there were also the Bogomils, there were also the Manichaeans. And these people were pretty much saying the same thing, that it is immoral, it is unethical to impose new spirits into mortal bodies to suffer for no reason, to keep this insane cycle going for the sick amusement of a deficient and malevolent God who most people worship as being the source of good, which is in and of itself a spiritual perversion in a way, because they believe that this demonic entity is all good, all benevolent. And this delusion is what fuels them to keep having this kind of optimism bias, this blind optimism toward the world, that God created the world in goodness and therefore everything is good, everything created is good. And so they are not able to see past this spell that has been placed over them by this wicked entity. So these Cathars were really just revolutionary people. And as well as the other Gnostic sects that had existed around the time, But it goes back even further to Buddhism. The first man, I forget his name, Siddhartha Gautama, I believe. He was the first Buddha. And his philosophy was that life is suffering. And, all sentient life in this world, this physical reality, suffers. And therefore, it should be resisted. You shouldn't procreate new life into this endless cycle of suffering, birth, and death. It is a wheel of torment that should not be allowed to continue. And so those spiritual beings, those empathetic beings aware of this situation, should do everything in their power to stop it. If you can't break the wheel, stop the wheel from turning. And that really is the true spirit behind anti-natalism. It is the true foundation of this movement, this need, this want to stop endless suffering from continuing, to stop the perpetuation of harm and death and cruelty that has reigned on this planet for millennia. And it is done in true empathy and true altruism to kind of wrap this up, like it's gone on long enough and it just needs to stop. And so I think that all of us here, we are all playing our part in this great endeavor, this kind of war, if you will, to help aid in bringing this to an end. And I think there is no more noble goal than that, than to stand up against this corrupt system of death and birth and suffering, and to say no and to resist it with everything that we have. And that is what I'm committed to. That is why I draw so heavily toward these Gnostics and toward the Gnostic philosophy in general, because everything about it makes perfect sense to me. While we don't have any proof of a benevolent, all-powerful God existing, we could certainly make the case that if there is a God, it is indeed most malevolent and evil and does not deserve either our worship or reverence.